Today, we are taking you into a conflict that is fought not just with shells and tanks, but with code, with laws, and with words.
Yeah.
We're looking far beyond the trenches to really dissect the whole ecosystem of information control and cyber warfare surrounding the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This deep dive is designed to give you that comprehensive understanding of the strategies being deployed, both on the front lines and, inside the minds of millions.
And our mission today is to define and explore what security experts and political analysts are increasingly calling the Informational-Kinetic Nexus.
The Informational-Kinetic Nexus.
Exactly. We've synthesized a massive stack of sources, from global security reports, academic surveys, to deep political analyses to show you how Russia has strategically fused propaganda and physical conflict. It's really a unified campaign. The domestic information fortress creates the necessary political and moral justification for the strategic brutality that follows abroad.
That phrase, informational-kinetic nexus, it sounds highly academic, but it's actually the perfect framing for this, isn't it? Because it immediately connects these abstract ideas like censorship to tangible results, like psychological trauma and mass displacement.
It does.
So to start understanding how this system works, we have to look inward first. We have to analyze the architecture of control that ensures a compliant home front, which, as our sources emphasize, is absolutely necessary for Russia to sustain protracted aggression.
And this architecture is built on a philosophical foundation that views information not as a marketplace of ideas, but fundamentally as a weapon.
A weapon, yeah.
The root of this view goes back surprisingly far, arguably crystallizing after the disastrous First Chechen War in the mid-1990s. The Kremlin consensus, led personally by Vladimir Putin, was that the reason for military setbacks and, frankly, defeat wasn't poor battlefield strategy,
Right.
but the independent journalists who had reported critically on the conflict and supposedly undermined public support for the war effort.
So the very act of accurate, critical reporting became redefined as a national security threat. That's a total inversion of the role of the press.
It is, and this mindset was codified into strategy with the 2000 Information Security Doctrine. This document is crucial because it established the blueprint for transforming state control into national policy. It didn't just discuss protecting, technical infrastructure.
What did it list then?
It listed threats ranging from degradation of spiritual values and weakening of the spiritual, moral, and creative potential of Russians to outright manipulation of information.
Wait, I want to linger on that for a second. The doctrine views degradation of spiritual values as an information security threat. That suggests that any information which challenges the moral or cultural hegemony of the state is inherently destabilizing.
Precisely. It's an expansive, almost ideological definition of security. And crucially, the document identified a major external threat as the desire of some countries to dominate in the global information space. And this provided the official state license to justify aggressive censorship and information isolation because they framed it as a necessary defense against foreign manipulation and, spiritual degradation.
So once that doctrine was in place, the state could build its apparatus. The sources define the domestic control system as the iron triangle of informational totalitarianism. Let's break down those three sides. What are we looking at?
Okay, so you have media saturation, legislative terror, and physical repression. These three elements work synergistically to eliminate any internal critique.
And legislative terror sounds like the sharpest point.
It is. It's the use of legal instruments to create a constant fear of severe consequence. This fear, in turn, drives widespread self-censorship, which is the ultimate goal, right? It means the state doesn't have to monitor every single citizen.
And the most powerful piece of this legislative terror came right after the 2022 full-scale invasion.
Absolutely. The government passed a sweeping law criminalizing the publication of knowingly false information about the military. The ambiguity of knowingly false means anything contradicting the official government line can be criminalized, and the penalties are staggering.
How staggering are we talking?
Prison sentences of up to 15 years.
Wow.
This law instantly forced dozens of independent media outlets to either stop reporting on the conflict altogether or, just shut down their operations entirely.
And we have these tragic, highly publicized examples of this law being enforced, which I assume send a very clear message to the population about the costs of dissent.
The enforcement is designed to be exemplary and terrifying. Take Ilya Yashin, a well-known opposition politician. He was sentenced to 8.5 years in a penal colony.
For what?
Merely for discussing the widely documented Bucha killings in a YouTube video. It wasn't a call to action. It was a factual discussion drawing on international reporting.
8.5 years for a video.
Then there's Maria Ponomarenko, a journalist, who received a 6-year sentence simply for a social media post regarding the Mariupol theater airstrike.
We're talking about consequences on par with serious violent crimes handed down for exercising free speech.
And this legislative action is backed up by physical repression, the third leg of the triangle, which targets any visible public resistance. The sheer scale is, it's difficult to grasp. Over 21,000 Russians have faced fines, arrests, detention, or imprisonment for criticizing the authorities or participating in protests since the beginning of the invasion.
And officials just openly label dissenters as national traitors, right? Which further encourages social ostracization.
Exactly.
So if the state is actively criminalizing critique and physically repressing public dissent, what happens to that institutionalized critical capacity within Russia? The lawyers, the academics, the journalists.
It leads to what analysts refer to as the strategic decapitation of institutionalized internal critique. The repression has resulted in a mass flight. Dmitry Muratov, the Nobel laureate who directed Novaya Gazeta, he drew this striking historical analogy, saying that the journalist's plane has replaced the historical philosopher's ship.
That refers to the Bolsheviks exiling hundreds of leading intellectuals a century ago. That's a heavy metaphor, suggesting the modern state is just purging its critical thinkers.
It is a deliberate intellectual and journalistic purge. More than 150 independent journalists have fled the country. And while they continue their work from abroad, relying on complex VPNs and digital circumvention tools, their critique is pushed entirely outside Russia's borders.
Which eliminates their ability to exert direct political pressure or engage the internal political system.
Right, and that leaves the space wide open for the final leg of the triangle, media saturation.
So if the critical voices are either imprisoned or exiled, the state media has a clear run. How dominant is state-controlled information?
Extremely dominant. Around 85% of Russians rely heavily on state media for their information. This engineered saturation ensures that the public narrative, the framework through which they understand the conflict, is entirely filtered through the official Kremlin lens, effectively manufacturing public consent or, at the very minimum, compliance.
But the sources also paint a really complicated picture of public opinion. It's not necessarily widespread, enthusiastic support, is it? It seems more like a mixture of fear, fatigue, and just strategic avoidance.
That's the key subtlety we need to understand. The system thrives on apathy as much as active support. On the one hand, a 2023 survey found that 64% of Russians surveyed supported internet censorship.
64%.
Yeah, with 45% viewing it as a matter of safety. This demonstrates a significant success in getting the populace to internalize the state's security framework.
But on the other hand, the numbers show this massive political disengagement.
Exactly. The vast majority of citizens, 52% reported, being only slightly interested or not interested in politics at all. Experts interpret this detachment as a simple, survival-based reaction to the establishment of a full-fledged authoritarian regime. When dissent is criminalized, avoidance becomes the safest political position.
And we have evidence of how profoundly difficult it is even for researchers to gauge the true level of internal support or opposition because of that pervasive fear.
This is one of the most chilling statistics in the sources. When one research group tried to conduct a large-scale survey on attitudes toward the war, they found that 29,400 out of the 31,000 people they contacted refused to answer the questions once they heard the topic was the conflict.
Wow. So the fear itself becomes the data.
It does. That level of refusal renders polling nearly meaningless and is a powerful indicator of the fear instilled by the Iron Triangle. Citizens simply fear that answering truthfully, even anonymously to a researcher, could lead to consequences.
That paints a comprehensive and frankly terrifying picture of the domestic information fortress. Now we shift gears to part 2, the global information war. And what's fascinating here is that the strategic goal flips entirely when it's directed outward. Domestically, the goal is compliance and enforced belief.
Right.
Internationally, the goal appears to be enforced doubt and chaos.
That is the crucial distinction we must grasp. Russia's external information operations are focused less on making allies believe their narrative and more on sowing global chaos, skepticism, and eroding the international unity necessary for the West to sustain opposition. And this is intrinsically linked to their highly evolved history of cyber warfare.
What's fascinating here is the ideological, almost philosophical gap in how Russia and the West fundamentally approach cyberspace.
Their priorities are diametrically opposed. Russia prioritizes information security and state control of the internet, viewing the free flow of information itself as the primary strategic risk, which is a continuation of that 2000 doctrine we talked about.
Right.
Western countries, conversely, focus on protecting personal data, privacy, and the critical infrastructure necessary to maintain services. This ideological clash is why Moscow's attempts to set international norms for cyberspace often fail.
But Russia's history of using cyber tools for espionage isn't new. It dates back to the height of the Cold War. You mentioned the 1989 Hunter case. What was so significant about that?
The Hunter case, which was tracked by the U.S. astronomer Clifford Stoll, was pivotal because it showed the dawning of cheap, scalable, and deniable espionage. Stoll tracked down German hackers who were infiltrating U.S. military systems, stealing thousands of pages of classified documents, passwords, and hacking techniques.
And selling them directly to the Soviet KGB.
Exactly.
And what was the payment for this highly classified data?
It was $54,000 and, quite bizarrely, quantities of cocaine.
That's wild.
It is. But the core takeaway was that U.S. technological superiority was starting to become a vulnerability. The investigators even used a classic counter tactic, setting up a honeypot, a trap involving fake documents about the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, to lure the hackers into staying online long enough to be traced. It was a clear signal that this new digital battlefield was open for business.
So, cyber conflict started as espionage. When did it transition into an overt military tool?
The transition happened relatively quickly in the 21st century. The 2007 attacks against Estonia were a clear milestone. Those were massive distributed denial of service, or DDoS, attacks that effectively shut down critical government and banking services. Then came the 2008 attacks during the Georgia conflict. These were early signals of information warfare integrated directly with kinetic warfare. These events were so serious that NATO officially recognized cyberspace as an operational domain of military conflict at the 2016 Warsaw Summit.
So the state infrastructure of control developed internally started to be weaponized externally through organized large-scale operations like troll factories.
Absolutely. Russia institutionalized political trolling, deploying massive troll factories that serve a dual strategic purpose. Domestically, they're used to smother dissident voices and suppress political mobilization. They intentionally flood the internet with noise, making informed or serious debate nearly impossible. It's a technique experts have aptly dubbed neutralization.
Neutralization, that's a fascinating concept. So it's not about convincing anyone.
Right.
It's about making the entire digital conversation toxic and useless.
Exactly. It undermines the internet as a space for genuine democratic action or informed critique, allowing the regime to avoid outright costly coercion or censorship. Externally, this tactic mutates into what is sometimes called trickster diplomacy. It aims to inject chaos and radical skepticism into the liberal order, undermining Western democratic processes without being conclusively attributable back to Moscow.
And we have that famous quote from Defense Minister Shoigu that perfectly encapsulates this philosophy of deniability.
Yes. During the 2014 Donbass War, when he was asked about Russian troops, he said, "It's very difficult to look for a black cat in a dark room, especially if it is not there. All the more stupid to look for it there if this cat is clever, brave, and polite."
So that's the essence of their asymmetric strategy. If we intervene, we're clever enough to be undetectable, and therefore we're immune from liability.
Pretty much.
And we know the key state-backed groups executing these advanced persistent threats, or APTs. We should probably explain what an APT is for you.
Right. So APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. It's not a single attack. It's a stealthy, ongoing effort by an attacker, often state-sponsored, to gain unauthorized access to a network and remain undetected for a prolonged period. The two most notorious Russian groups are APT-28, known as Fancy Bear or Tsar Team, linked to the GRU military intelligence.
Right, Fancy Bear, we hear that name a lot.
And APT-29, known as Cozy Bear or the Dukes.
And APT-28 has a long and highly effective history of targeting political and electoral processes in the West.
They are notoriously aggressive. They were attributed to attacks on the Ukrainian Central Election Committee networks in 2014. And globally, they executed the highly disruptive 2017 French presidential election, targeting the Macron leaks.
How does they do that?
They used email spoofing to deliver malicious attachments to campaign staffers attempting to interfere directly in a major European election. We also saw their sheer technical prowess in the 2017 NotPetya attack, a massively destructive piece of ransomware that was disguised as a typical criminal enterprise but was clearly state-backed.
And even outside of elections, Their scope covers pure cyber espionage against critical data integrity.
Yes, they have successfully conducted cyber espionage against key government networks in Germany, Norway, and Denmark, demonstrating their capacity to sustain long-term intelligence operations. However, the one constant difficulty in all of this remains attribution.
How does the challenge of attribution complicate the global response to cyber aggression?
It complicates everything. Attackers and even defenders frequently use false flags and honeypots or intermediate systems to intentionally make an uninvolved third party look like the adversary. This makes conclusive identification and subsequent retaliation incredibly complex. It's an environment tailor-made for trickster diplomacy, where plausible deniability is always maintained.
Before we move on to the actual narratives, I want to highlight one fascinating point about the perceived gravity of cyber conflict. The US and Russia actually equated cyber risk to nuclear risk at one point.
They did. In 2013, the two countries established a digital red telephone. This was a direct communications line specifically for cyber crisis management, intended to prevent small-scale digital incidents from escalating into a major conflict.
And this wasn't built from scratch.
No, and this is the crucial part. It was integrated directly into the existing infrastructure of the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center. That decision alone highlights that, at the highest levels of global security, cyber conflict was already being perceived as having the same potential for catastrophic existential risk as nuclear warfare.
Here's where it gets really interesting, moving from the operational mechanics to the disinformation narratives themselves. Russia needs global stories to justify the invasion and erode external support. And the first and most central narrative is denazification.
This is the primary foundational claim, that Ukraine is a neo-Nazi state committing genocide, thus requiring a military intervention framed as liberation. The sheer volume of evidence against this claim is overwhelming, but Russia persists because it draws on, historical trauma from World War II.
So what are the specific facts from our sources that just dismantle this narrative?
Well, first, the world's foremost authorities on the Holocaust and genocide have universally condemned Putin's narrative. We're talking about scholars of genocide, the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Yad Vashem. They all explicitly rejected and condemned the Kremlin's abuse and distortion of Holocaust history to justify the invasion.
And Ukrainian Jews themselves have rejected it.
Publicly and repeatedly. And beyond that, Russian propagandists even went so far as to twist Ukraine's constitution to try and prove their narrative.
How?
They cited an article from the Ukrainian constitution concerning the preservation of the gene pool. Pro-Russian accounts claimed this proved that Ukrainians were fascists focused on racial purity.
But what's the real context?
In reality, Article 16 of the Constitution relates explicitly to overcoming the massive ecological and health impacts of the Chernobyl disaster, not racial ideology. Moreover, Article 24 explicitly guarantees equal rights for all citizens, regardless of origin, race, or religion.
But we have to acknowledge the key strategic nuance here. Russia exploits the existence of far-right groups like the controversial Azov Regiment to try and discredit the entire Ukrainian military and state apparatus. That's the thing you always hear, right?
That is precisely how effective disinformation works. It takes a small, complex, and controversial element, and the Azov Regiment certainly has a history of neo-Nazi leanings and controversial symbols, and uses it to smear the entire state, the entire war effort, and every Ukrainian soldier.
So it's total guilt by association.
Completely. And we must also note that many experts have concluded they were arguably more real fascists and neo-Nazis fighting on the Russian side groups, like the Rusich group or elements within the Kremlin-sponsored Wagner group, than on the Ukrainian side, especially early in the conflict. The issue of extremism is used purely as a rhetorical cudgel.
Okay, the second core narrative is the NATO provocation claim, that Russia was forced to invade in self-defense due to NATO expansion and Western aggression.
The timeline of agreements and actions just renders this narrative highly dubious. Russia signed the 1999 Charter for European Security, which affirmed every single state's right to choose its own security arrangements, including joining alliances like NATO if they wished.
And more crucially, Ukraine wasn't even trying to join NATO for most of this period.
Exactly. It was officially neutral until December 2014. It voted to end that neutral status only after Russia had already annexed Crimea and orchestrated the invasion of Donbass.
So, Russia's own aggression was the primary catalyst pushing Ukraine toward the very alliance Moscow claimed to fear. The timeline just doesn't add up.
It really doesn't. Ukraine only formally applied to join NATO in response to the 2022 full-scale invasion. As policy experts like Stephen Pfeiffer have pointed out, Russia's aggressive actions have done more to push Ukraine closer to the alliance than any NATO outreach ever could have. The sources suggest the real motivation isn't fear of NATO membership, but Putin's desire to prevent NATO from bullying Russia's neighbors and the deeper historical goal of recreating a greater Russia or a sphere of unquestioned influence.
The third narrative cluster is war crime denial and deflection, which must be deployed instantly whenever an atrocity is documented by international bodies.
And denial is instantaneous and absolute. Russian officials, like Foreign Minister Lavrov, immediately labeled events like the Bucha massacre a fake attack or, staged by the Ukrainians themselves.
And the deflection tactics are pretty sophisticated.
Very. For instance, when the Mariupol maternity hospital was shelled, Russian officials claimed it had been converted into a military base for radical fighters. Or in Olenivka, where independent military experts concluded the damage was consistent with a Russian-orchestrated sabotage operation designed to kill Ukrainian prisoners of war, Russian state media instantly reported it as a Ukrainian missile attack targeting their own captured soldiers.
They also target international aid, don't they?
They do. They promote narratives in Europe that Ukraine is selling Western weapons on the black market, a lie designed to fuel internal political discord in supporting nations and erode Western confidence.
I have to bring up the most extreme narrative because it crosses over into the absurd, the claims of Satanism and black magic. Why would the state media use language that sounds like it belongs in a medieval text?
This is where the informational psychological campaign reaches its most effective level of dehumanization and moral justification. By framing the enemy not just as neo-Nazis, but as practitioners of black magic or Satanism, it morally justifies total annihilation.
You're saying this is a calculated strategy.
It is. Russian state media claim that evidence of satanic seals and weapons consecrated with blood magic was found in eastern Ukrainian villages.
And this wasn't just fringe media. High-ranking officials use this terminology.
Precisely. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev described the invasion as a sacred war against Satan. And even more disturbingly, Alexei Pavlov, an assistant secretary of Russia's Security Council, called for the de-Satanization of Ukraine and controversially included the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic Jewish movement as one of the hundreds of neo-pagan cults that needed to be rooted out.
That's just the worst. I mean,
Russia's chief rabbi publicly condemned it as a new variety of old blood libels. This narrative is purely designed to remove any moral constraint on the use of extreme force.
if we connect this now to the bigger picture, we transition from the tactics and narratives to the tangible human impact. The informational-kinetic nexus means that the propaganda is the political justification for physical action, and that action leads directly to suffering. Let's start with the difficulty of resistance inside Russia. How does the grassroots movement operate when facing the Iron Triangle?
The Russian anti-war movement is highly fractured and largely decentralized. Public protest is often viewed less as a functional tool for political change and more as, well, a moral obligation or a symbolic gesture, because the risk of severe long-term imprisonment is so incredibly high.
So it's an act of moral witness, knowing it won't functionally stop the war.
Exactly. And you see that manifested in incredibly brave but nonviolent personal acts of resistance that carry life-altering penalties.
What are some examples?
Look at the poet Artem Kamardin, who was detained and sentenced for reading anti-war poetry in a public square. Or Sasha Skochelenko, the artist who changed supermarket price tags in St. Petersburg to small anti-war messages and now faces years in prison. These acts demonstrate the crushing efficiency of the domestic fortress. Tiny, symbolic acts of resistance are treated as severe national crimes.
And for the thousands of activists, journalists, and intellectuals who have fled, what challenges do they face trying to sustain the resistance from exile?
The challenges are immense, both structural and psychological. Structurally, many anti-war initiatives abroad lack official NGO status. Our sources state 80% do not have official NGO status because European host nations regard associations of Russians, even anti-war ones, with considerable caution.
Which means they can't access traditional funding or institutional support.
Right, so the work falls on dedicated volunteers, leading to inevitable activist burnout. It creates a severe humanitarian and psychological burden. The work is entirely volunteer-driven, often involving unpaid, emotionally exhausting labor, like working directly with Ukrainian refugees or assisting defectors. It becomes a full-fledged, high-stress, and deeply challenging second job that drains the individual's mental resources.
That's the repression side of the human cost. Now let's look at the direct kinetic cost on the civilian population in Ukraine, specifically the quantifiable mental health crisis. We have hard numbers here.
The numbers are stark, and they demonstrate the measurable psychological fallout of that informational-kinetic nexus we've been talking about. War exposure has led to a severe, measurable mental health crisis among Ukrainian civilians. We have cohort studies tracking mental health indicators during the initial months of the invasion, so from February 2022 to July 2022.
What did those 5 months reveal about the psychological damage?
The share of people reporting living in a state close to suicide nearly tripled. It rose sharply from 0.6% to 1.7%. That is a massive, rapid escalation of existential despair. Furthermore, the share of people feeling helpless, the psychological precursor to withdrawal and depression, also nearly tripled, rising dramatically from 6.6% to 17.1%.
That jump in helplessness and suicidal ideation, it just underscores that the consequences of this conflict are lasting long after the bombs fall.
And the research explicitly linked these severe mental health challenges to two key factors: loss of employment, which removes financial stability, and intermittent bombings, which maintain a constant state of fear. This evidence clearly indicates that future recovery and stabilization efforts must prioritize job opportunities and establishing safe, predictable environments, not just physical reconstruction.
And this psychological toll is amplified by Russia's calculated terror tactics, which our sources argue fit the legal definition of spreading terror among a civilian population.
They absolutely do. The use of sustained kinetic force and the targeting of civilian populations are explicitly designed to spread terror among the populace. This fulfills the legal definition found under Article 51.2 of Additional Protocol Best of the Geneva Conventions, which specifically prohibits acts of violence committed with the primary purpose of spreading terror among the civilian population.
What examples demonstrate this calculated intent?
The methods are designed to maximize unpredictability and anxiety. Take the use of drones in places like Kherson. Residents describe feeling actively hunted. Unlike predictable artillery that hits zones, these drones individually stalk and strike their targets, zeroing in on vulnerable everyday locations: crowded markets, post offices, cafes.
Commuters on their way to work?
Exactly. Residents report that this introduces a terrifying personal element compared to shelling. As one resident observed, with a drone, it's suddenly there, it sees you, and you are done.
That's a deeply effective psychological weapon because it invades the perceived safety of routine. The mundane act of going to the store becomes a life-threatening decision.
It does. Other calculated terror tactics include scattering butterfly anti-personnel mines in public squares. These mines are designed to blend in with leaves and brush and have led to a significant rise in foot amputations among civilians. This comprehensive campaign of targeting civilians during daily activities provides strong evidence of the intent to spread terror, constituting a serious violation of the law of armed conflict.
So, what does this all mean for us, the global audience, trying to navigate this complex, charged, and often contradictory information environment? We have to examine how the news about these tactics and narratives is being delivered to us in the West.
This is the ultimate challenge of modern conflict, the issue of objectivity in wartime. Media scholars observe that media tends to be objective during peacetime, but often adopts a preparatory or outright propaganda role during the active phase of total war, justifying the conflict and disseminating favored state messages.
And given that this is a diffused war, amplified across multiple media channels, the polarization effect is intensified.
It is.
We have a fascinating critical analysis comparing how two major Western outlets, the BBC and CNN, frame the conflict, using indicators of war journalism versus peace journalism. Let's unpack the primary findings about the overall framing.
The analysis found a heavy and consistent predominance of war journalism indicators over peace journalism indicators. This isn't surprising, but the numbers show how the narrative is constructed. Overall framing heavily relied on three factors: marked visibility of war effects, the direct violence and destruction, and 67% of articles, emphasis on elite and official sources in 62%, and frequent good-bad tagging, explicitly labeling sides, in 60%.
When you have a massive emphasis on elite sources and clear good-bad tagging, how does that affect the listener's ability to understand the deeper context of the conflict?
It reduces the public's ability to analyze information impartially. War journalism frames the conflict primarily through the lens of competition and winners and losers, often sidelining efforts toward mediation, diplomacy, or the complex historical roots of the conflict, which are often the focus of peace journalism.
And the analysis even found notable contrasts in the rhetorical approaches of the two major outlets studied, the BBC and CNN.
Yes. The BBC exhibited a significantly higher level of partisanship, scoring 80% compared to CNN's 55%.
That's a huge difference.
It is. The BBC adopted a more overtly aggressive posture, more noticeably employing dehumanization and victimization tactics aimed at the opposing side. While CNN was still partial, it maintained a generally more neutral rhetorical stance compared to the BBC's more pronounced adversarial tone.
So that difference in partisanship score, 80% versus 55%, is substantial. How did that higher partisanship manifest in the BBC's coverage? Can you give us an example of those discursive strategies?
It manifested through the selection of focus and visual content. For instance, the analysis found specific strategies employed to downplay or normalize the presence of controversial far-right movements in Ukraine.
How so?
Instead of directly addressing the political implications of groups like the Azov Regiment, some articles used visual content of civilians, including women, children, and the elderly training with wooden rifles.
So they visually transformed a controversial military group into a sympathetic image of broad, heroic civil defense.
Precisely. It's narrative engineering. It risks destigmatizing the movement by portraying it as being close to the people and part of a collective, heroic national defense effort rather than a separate political entity with a complicated history. The analysis also noted that articles often minimized or avoided the role that neo-Nazi and far-right movements played in the decisive moments of the 2014 Euromaidan events, attempting to subtly close the discussion on these inconvenient historical truths.
Finally, we have to discuss one of the most serious findings, the subtle yet globally catastrophic potential of, quote, manipulation, specifically regarding the nuclear threat. This demonstrates how narrative control in the West can also destabilize the situation.
This is a perfect illustration of how slight recontextualization can drastically change the intended meaning, especially on a topic with existential global consequences. The analysis identified a CNN video that combined and truncated quotes from President Putin and a pro-Russian commander to suggest that Russia was actively and offensively threatening nuclear war against the West.
What was the crucial context that was omitted or trimmed away?
The original, full quotes, which were edited out, clearly emphasized that Russia would only use nuclear weapons in response to a strike on its own territory, defining the threshold as a defensive contingent response.
So they just cut off the part that says in response to.
Exactly. And by selectively trimming the quotes and combining them with concurrent reports about Russia violating nuclear arms control agreements, the narrative shifted from Russia defining its defensive red line to Russia actively posing an offensive, unprovoked nuclear threat.
That kind of discourse manipulation, particularly on the topic of nuclear threats, poses a significant threat to global stability because it elevates tension unnecessarily and risks increasing polarization at the diplomatic level. It's hard to imagine a more dangerous form of information imbalance.
It highlights that the challenge of finding impartial truth is not limited to the source material coming out of the Kremlin. It exists across the board. The reliance on elite sources and the adoption of an aggressive posture, even in defense of democratic principles, risks oversimplifying the conflict and making complex diplomatic solutions harder to achieve. The crucial takeaway from this deep dive into the information war is the operational reality of the Informational-Kinetic Nexus. Russia's strategy relies fundamentally on this link. Domestic censorship and global disinformation create the necessary political space for calculated strategic brutality. And this leads directly to measurable psychological damage in Ukraine, manifesting as those tripled rates of helplessness and suicidal ideation among civilians and the political and intellectual isolation enforced upon dissenting Russians through the Iron Triangle. The informational war is not a secondary theater, it is the foundation upon which the entire conflict is built.
The research highlights that war reporting is inherently challenging, and professional journalistic norms like objectivity are intensely pressured during conflict. The guidance for you, the listener, is clear. As you consume news, particularly during periods of intense international conflict, seek out information that will expose truths from all sides and uncover all cover-ups. So, here is a provocative thought for you to mull over as you consume the news this week. Considering the demonstrable partisan bias found in some Western media coverage, does this bias, even when framed as defending democratic values, risk increasing polarization and inadvertently contributing to the escalation of conflict by reducing the public's ability to analyze information impartially? Think about what truths might be exposed if the reporting focused more on the complexity and less on the competition.